We have executed a major operation this morning targeting the suspected kingpin of an underground network.
A cold Chicago morning, sirens screaming through the streets, police cars sealing off intersections, detectives moving from house to house with warrants in their hands. After months of surveillance, investigators believed they were finally closing in on one of the most influential drug traffickers operating in the city. The operation had taken time. Officers had tracked vehicles, studied meeting locations, collected statements, watched entire neighborhoods that seemed connected by a network most outsiders could barely understand. The target was a man whose name carried weight on both sides of the law, Willie Cage, better known on the streets as Superfly. Authorities believed they were preparing for a breakthrough. Instead, they ran into a wall. People stopped talking. Potential witnesses disappeared, information dried up, and once again, the man at the center of it all remained out of reach. For investigators, it was frustrating. For people living in the neighborhoods where Cage's influence was strongest, it wasn't surprising at all. By then, his reputation had already become larger than the man himself. Stories about Superfly traveled through barber shops, apartment buildings, street corners, and crowded block parties. Some stories were true, others grew larger every time they were told, but together they created something powerful. A legend, the kind of legend that can make a man seem untouchable, yet none of it happened overnight. Long before law enforcement considered him a major target, before his name became linked to multimillion-dollar drug operations, Willie Cage was growing up in a city that was changing fast. A city where entire neighborhoods were being shaped by poverty, violence, gangs, and the underground economy. And for many young men, the choices available were often limited. To understand how Superfly became one of the most recognized figures in Chicago's criminal world, you first have to understand the environment that created him. Because legends are rarely born, more often they are built, one decision at a time. Why Chicago in the 1970s and 1980s was a city of contrasts. In some areas, businesses thrived and families built comfortable lives. In others, unemployment, crime, and economic decline were becoming part of everyday reality. Entire communities were dealing with challenges that few politicians seemed capable of solving. For young people growing up in those neighborhoods, survival often meant learning the rules of the street long before adulthood. It was in that environment that Willie Cage came of age. The streets taught lessons quickly. Weakness could be exploited. Trust had to be earned, and opportunities, whether legal or illegal, were usually claimed by the people willing to take risks. As Cage got older, he began developing a reputation for understanding how the street economy worked. Unlike many who acted on impulse, he was known for thinking several moves ahead. People who crossed paths with him often described someone who paid attention. Someone who watched, someone who learned. Those qualities would later become valuable assets in the criminal world. By the time crack cocaine began transforming cities across America, enormous amounts of money were flowing through illegal drug markets. Neighborhoods changed almost overnight. Small-time hustlers saw opportunities to become major players. Territories became more valuable, competition became more dangerous, violence became more common. For ambitious individuals, the rewards could be enormous. For everyone else, the consequences could be devastating. Willie Cage saw the opportunity, and unlike many others chasing quick money, he approached the game with a long-term mindset. While others focused on individual transactions, Cage reportedly focused on building connections, relationships, networks, the kinds of things that could create lasting influence. As his involvement in the drug trade expanded, so did his reputation. People began hearing his name in more places, more neighborhoods, more conversations, The money was increasing. The influence was growing, and the foundation of what would eventually become the Superfly Empire was quietly taking shape. But success in Chicago's underground world came with a problem. The moment people started noticing your rise, they also started watching your next move. Rivals paid attention, gangs paid attention, police paid attention, and as Willie Cage continued climbing higher, it became clear that his future would not be defined by ordinary street hustling. Something much bigger was beginning to emerge, an empire that would eventually place him among the most talked about figures in Chicago's criminal underworld. And as his power grew, so did the number of people who wanted a piece of it. Some wanted to work with him. Others wanted to replace him. The conflict that followed would help shape the next chapter of the Superfly story. A chapter filled with money, influence, and a level of power that few people could have imagined when Willie Cage first stepped into the streets of Chicago. The rise nobody saw coming by the time. Willie Cage began gaining real traction in Chicago's underground economy. The city was already changing. The drug trade was becoming larger, faster, and far more profitable than it had been just a few years earlier. Money was moving through neighborhoods at a staggering pace. Entire street organizations were fighting for territory. Young hustlers were entering the game every day, hoping to earn a reputation before somebody else took their place. Most never lasted long. Some were arrested, some disappeared, some became victims of the violence that surrounded the business. Very few managed to build anything that lasted. Willie Cage appeared determined to be one of those few. While others focused on quick profits, he reportedly understood something many people overlooked. Power wasn't built through a single deal. It was built through control of territory, control of supply, control of relationships. The people around him began noticing that he wasn't operating like an ordinary street hustler. He was thinking bigger. Every successful move increased his influence. Every new connection expanded his reach. And every dollar earned gave him more room to grow. Soon, his name was being mentioned in places where it had never been heard before, not because he was looking for attention, but because success naturally attracts attention. In the underground world, reputation spreads faster than advertisements ever could. People hear stories, they compare experiences, they talk, and before long, the stories surrounding Willie Cage started taking on a life of their own. Some described him as intelligent. Others described him as calculating. Many simply described him as dangerous. Regardless of which version was true, one thing became increasingly clear. His operation was growing. As the years passed, Cage allegedly built relationships that helped strengthen his position within Chicago's criminal landscape. The exact details often remain disputed, buried beneath decades of rumors, investigations, and street mythology. But one fact remained consistent: his influence continued expanding, and expansion creates challenges. The larger an organization becomes, the more pressure it faces. More money means more risk. More territory means more rivals. More visibility means more law enforcement attention. Every successful criminal enterprise eventually reaches a point where growth becomes both its greatest strength and its greatest weakness. For Willie Cage, that moment was approaching. The streets respected power, but they also tested it. Competitors constantly looked for weaknesses. Former allies could become enemies overnight. A trusted associate today could become tomorrow's informant. The environment rewarded strength but punished mistakes. That reality forced people at the top to remain constantly alert. One bad decision could destroy years of work. One betrayal could bring everything crashing down. And as Cage's profile continued rising, the stakes became higher than ever. Yet despite the risks, his reputation continued to grow. People began attaching a nickname to his name. A nickname that would eventually become far more famous than Willie Cage itself, Superfly. It was the kind of name that fit perfectly within the mythology of the streets. Memorable, recognizable, difficult to ignore. Soon, people who had never even met him knew the nickname. And with every retelling, the legend grew larger. The problem with becoming a legend is that legends attract challengers. The more successful Superfly became, the more people wanted what he had. Some wanted his position. Some wanted his territory. Some simply wanted to prove that he wasn't as untouchable as people claimed. Those ambitions would eventually create a dangerous chain reaction, because Chicago's underworld wasn't large enough for everyone to dominate. Power always came at someone else's expense, and whenever large amounts of money are involved, conflict is never far behind. As the city entered one of its most turbulent periods, tensions across the streets continued rising. Old rivalries intensified, new alliances formed, the balance of power shifted repeatedly. In the middle of it all stood Willie Superfly Cage. His influence was stronger than ever. His reputation was spreading faster than ever, and his empire was approaching a level that would make him impossible to ignore. Not just to rivals, not just to gangs, but to the people whose job was to bring powerful men down. Because while Superfly was building his empire on the streets, another group had quietly started paying attention. Investigators, detectives, federal agents, and before long, they would begin asking a simple question. Who exactly was Willie Cage, and how powerful had he really become? That question would lead them into a world far larger than they expected. A world where Superfly was no longer just another hustler. He was becoming one of the most influential figures in Chicago's criminal underworld. And his rise was only beginning. Chicago's untouchable king, by the time Willie Cage earned the nickname Superfly, he was no longer viewed as an up-and-coming figure. He had become an established force, the kind of man whose name carried weight before he even entered a room. On Chicago's streets, reputation mattered. Sometimes it mattered more than money, more than weapons, more than numbers. A powerful reputation could prevent conflicts before they started. It could attract allies, create opportunities, and convince people to think twice before making a move against you. For Superfly, that reputation was becoming one of his greatest assets. Stories about his influence continued spreading through neighborhoods across the city. Some stories were accurate, others were exaggerated. That often happens when a person reaches a certain level of notoriety. Facts and legends begin blending together until separating them becomes almost impossible. But whether every story was true didn't really matter. People believed them, and belief alone can create power. As his profile grew, so did the perception that Superfly wasn't operating like most people in the drug trade. Many street-level dealers focused on surviving week to week. Superfly was increasingly viewed as someone focused on building something larger, something structured, something capable of generating influence far beyond a single neighborhood. The money involved in Chicago's drug economy during that era was enormous. Entire organizations were competing for access to profitable territories. Every block had value. Every corner represented income. Every route carried opportunity. The competition was relentless. Yet despite the pressure, Superfly's position appeared secure. At least from the outside, people began viewing him as one of the men who had figured out how to navigate a dangerous world without constantly looking over his shoulder. That perception only strengthened his standing. The stronger his reputation became, the more difficult it became for rivals to challenge him. Because challenging a powerful figure is one thing, Defeating one is another. Many people underestimated the difference. And for a time, it seemed as though Superfly had mastered the game. His name generated respect. His influence continued expanding. His operation reportedly touched multiple areas of the city. From the outside, everything appeared to be moving in one direction. Upward, but criminal empires rarely remain stable forever. Success creates attention, attention creates pressure, and pressure eventually creates cracks. The first signs weren't always obvious. They rarely are. Small disputes, growing tensions, competing interests, the kinds of problems that can be managed individually but become dangerous when combined. Meanwhile, another problem was developing. Law enforcement agencies were becoming increasingly aggressive. Across the United States, authorities were investing more resources into major drug investigations. Federal agencies expanded operations. Task forces grew larger. Information sharing improved. Investigators began targeting not only street-level offenders, but also the individuals believed to be organizing entire networks. The goal was simple: remove the leadership, disrupt the structure, collapse the operation. For men like Superfly, that shift represented a serious threat. No longer were authorities satisfied with arresting low-level participants. They wanted the people at the top. And once investigators identify a target, they rarely stop looking. At first, Superfly's reputation may have helped protect him. People were reluctant to cooperate. Witnesses feared consequences. Information remained difficult to obtain. But law enforcement had something the streets often lacked: time. Investigators could spend months building cases. Years if necessary. They could wait for mistakes, wait for weaknesses, wait for opportunities, and every criminal enterprise eventually produces all three. The larger the operation becomes, the harder it becomes to keep everything under control. More people become involved. More secrets exist, more opportunities for betrayal emerge. The same network that helps create power can eventually become the thing that destroys it. Superfly was now operating at a level where every decision carried consequences. One misstep could trigger a chain reaction. One bad alliance could attract unwanted attention. One trusted individual could become a liability. Yet despite the risks, his legend continued growing. To supporters, he represented success. To rivals, he represented an obstacle. To investigators, he represented a target. And all three groups were moving toward the same inevitable collision. Because power doesn't simply attract admiration, it attracts opposition. The stronger Superfly became, the more people wanted to challenge him. Some wanted his territory, some wanted his influence, others wanted justice. No matter their motivation, they all shared one objective: bringing down the man many people believed couldn't be touched. The question was no longer whether pressure was building around Superfly. The pressure was already there. The real question was which side would make the first move. The answer would plunge Chicago's streets into a period of conflict, betrayal, and violence that would change everything. Because the next chapter of Superfly's story wasn't about building power. It was about defending it. And history has shown that keeping an empire is often far more difficult than creating one. Blood in the streets, every empire reaches a moment when growth stops being the biggest challenge. Survival becomes the challenge. For Willie, Superfly, Cage, that moment arrived when the competition around him became impossible to ignore. By then, Chicago's underground economy had evolved into a battlefield. The money involved was too large. The stakes were too high, and too many people wanted a piece of what others already controlled. Territory wasn't just territory. It represented customers, revenue, influence, power. Whoever controlled the streets controlled the money flowing through them. And nobody gave up that kind of power willingly. As tensions increased across the city, rivalries became more dangerous. Disputes that might once have ended with threats now carried far greater consequences. Trust became increasingly rare. Paranoia became increasingly common. People watched their backs, questioned loyalties, wondered who might be working with whom. In that environment, every rumor mattered. Every misunderstanding carried risks, and every act of violence threatened to trigger another. The streets entered a cycle that seemed impossible to stop. One conflict created another. One retaliation demanded a response. One death fueled the next. For the people living in affected neighborhoods, violence became an unfortunate reality of everyday life. Sirens were common. Police investigations became routine. Families learned to navigate an environment where danger could emerge without warning. Meanwhile, influential figures within the drug trade faced increasing pressure from every direction. Rivals wanted opportunities, associates wanted larger shares, law enforcement wanted arrests. Everyone was pursuing their own interests. And that made the landscape more unpredictable than ever. For Superfly, maintaining influence during such a period required constant vigilance. Success had placed him at the center of attention. That attention brought advantages, but it also brought enemies. The larger his reputation became, the larger the target on his back became. People began asking questions. Could Superfly maintain control? Could his network withstand growing pressure? Could his reputation survive the challenges that were emerging across Chicago? No empire is tested during periods of peace. Empires are tested during periods of conflict, and conflict was becoming impossible to avoid. The streets had changed, the environment had changed, the rules had changed. Individuals who once worked together found themselves pursuing different interests. Relationships that appeared strong from the outside sometimes proved fragile under pressure. History repeatedly shows that criminal organizations are often damaged less by outside attacks than by internal fractures. Ambition creates loyalty, but it can also create jealousy. Success attracts supporters, but it also attracts opportunists. The more valuable an empire becomes, the more people begin imagining themselves in control of it. That reality has destroyed countless organizations throughout history. And Chicago was no exception. At the same time, law enforcement agencies continued gathering information. Investigators studied connections, mapped relationships, tracked developments. Every conflict generated new leads. Every arrest created potential sources of information. Every mistake opened another door. What looked like chaos on the streets often looked like opportunity to detectives. Because chaos makes people vulnerable, and vulnerable people sometimes make decisions they wouldn't normally make. As pressure mounted, the walls around Superfly's world appeared to be closing in, not all at once. Not dramatically, but steadily, almost invisibly, the kind of pressure that accumulates over months and years until one day it becomes impossible to ignore. Yet, despite everything happening around him, the legend of Superfly remained alive. Stories continued circulating. His name continued generating attention. His influence continued commanding respect. To many people, he still appeared untouchable, but appearances can be deceptive, especially in the criminal underworld. The public often sees the image. They rarely see the cracks forming beneath it, and by this stage of the story, cracks were beginning to appear. Not necessarily visible to the streets, not necessarily visible to rivals, but visible to the people who had spent years trying to understand how his world operated. The investigators, the detectives, the federal agents, while violence dominated headlines and street conflicts consumed attention, authorities were quietly assembling something much more dangerous. A case, not a quick arrest, not a temporary disruption, a long-term effort aimed at reaching the people believed to be sitting at the top. And Willie's Superfly cage was now firmly within their sights. The streets were becoming more dangerous. The pressure was becoming more intense. The risks were becoming greater. But the greatest threat to Superfly's empire wasn't coming from a rival gang. It wasn't coming from a street war. It wasn't coming from a challenger seeking his position. It was coming from people willing to spend years waiting for the right moment to strike. And that moment was getting closer, because after years of watching, listening, and collecting information, law enforcement was finally preparing to make its move. The hunt for Superfly had truly begun. The manhunt begins for years. Willie Superfly cage had managed to stay ahead of the pressure. Rivals came and went. Street conflicts erupted and faded. Rumors spread. Investigations started. Yet somehow, his name remained connected to power. From the outside, it appeared as though Superfly had mastered something few others could: survival. But survival and invincibility are not the same thing. And by this point, law enforcement agencies were no longer looking at individual incidents. They were looking at patterns, patterns of relationships, patterns of movement, patterns of activity. The kind of patterns that only become visible after months or even years of investigation. Authorities understood that taking down a major criminal figure rarely happens overnight. Large organizations are complicated. People play different roles. Information is scattered across dozens of sources. Witnesses are often reluctant to cooperate. Cases take time, sometimes a lot of time. So investigators did what they had done countless times before. They waited, they watched, and they collected. Every arrest became a potential lead. Every seized document became a clue. Every conversation became a possible piece of a much larger puzzle. Slowly, that puzzle began taking shape. The challenge wasn't proving that crime existed. Everyone already knew crime existed. The challenge was connecting influential individuals to activities happening beneath them. That required patience, precision, and a willingness to keep building even when immediate results weren't visible. Meanwhile, life on the streets continued. Money kept moving, people kept hustling, conflicts continued emerging. From a distance, everything seemed normal, but behind the scenes, investigators were steadily reducing the space available for error. Every network depends on communication. Every organization depends on trust. And every organization becomes vulnerable when those elements begin breaking down. Law enforcement understood this. They knew that pressure alone could sometimes accomplish what direct action could not. The more attention an operation receives, the more difficult it becomes to function. People become nervous. Mistakes become more common. Relationships become strained. Questions begin emerging. Who can still be trusted? Who might be talking? Who is being watched? Fear has a way of spreading quickly. And once fear enters a criminal organization, stability often begins disappearing. For Superfly, the challenge wasn't simply avoiding rivals anymore. The challenge was managing an environment where threats could emerge from multiple directions at once. Street enemies were one problem, investigators were another. Potential informants represented an entirely different threat. History is filled with powerful criminal figures who survived violence only to be undone by information. A bullet can end a life. Information can end an empire. And investigators were searching aggressively for information. The goal wasn't merely to disrupt operations temporarily. The goal was to build a case strong enough to survive in court. That meant gathering evidence, corroborating facts, connecting individuals, establishing patterns. The process moved slowly. But it moved relentlessly. Every month brought new developments. Every year added more information. And eventually, the weight of that information became difficult to ignore. The pressure surrounding Superfly's world was now greater than it had ever been. Yet despite everything, many people still believed he would survive. After all, they had seen him survive before. They had watched him navigate dangerous situations. They had watched his reputation grow despite constant obstacles. To supporters, he remained a symbol of resilience. To rivals, he remained a problem. To law enforcement, he remained unfinished business. But history teaches a simple lesson: no empire lasts forever. No matter how powerful it appears, no matter how feared its leader becomes, no matter how strong its reputation seems, eventually, circumstances change. The same qualities that help build an empire can sometimes contribute to its downfall. Expansion creates visibility. Visibility attracts attention. Attention creates pressure. And pressure eventually forces a reckoning. For Willie Cage, that reckoning was approaching. Years of growth, years of influence, years of surviving a dangerous world. Everything was leading toward a decisive moment. The moment when stories, rumors, investigations, and reality would finally collide. The streets had known the name Superfly for years. Now the justice system was preparing to confront it directly. What happened next would determine whether the legend remained intact, or whether one of Chicago's most talked about criminal figures would finally face the consequences of a life built in shadows, because after years of chasing leads and assembling evidence, authorities believed they were closer than ever. Closer to the network, closer to the truth, and closer to Willie Superfly Cage himself. The empire that once seemed untouchable was about to face its greatest test, and the outcome would shape how the story of Superfly would be remembered for decades to come. How the empire finally fell for years. The legend of Superfly had seemed larger than life. On the streets, his name carried weight. Among rivals, it commanded attention. Within law enforcement circles, it represented a target that investigators had spent years trying to understand. But every story eventually reaches a turning point. Every empire reaches a moment when momentum begins moving in the opposite direction. And for Willie Superfly Cage, that moment was finally arriving. The change didn't happen overnight. Most downfalls don't. Contrary to what movies often portray, criminal empires rarely collapse in a single dramatic moment. They weaken gradually. Pressure accumulates, options disappear, mistakes become harder to recover from, and eventually, the structure that once appeared unstoppable begins showing signs of strain. By the time authorities intensified their efforts, the environment surrounding Superfly had become far different from the one that helped create his rise. Law enforcement possessed more resources, investigations were more sophisticated, communication between agencies had improved. The days when influential figures could rely solely on reputation and street loyalty were becoming increasingly difficult to sustain. The rules of the game had changed, and those changes affected everyone, not just Superfly, not just his associates. Everyone operating within the criminal world. The same networks that once created opportunities were now creating vulnerabilities. The same relationships that helped build influence were attracting scrutiny. The same visibility that strengthened reputations was generating attention from investigators. Years earlier, those factors had contributed to his success. Now they were contributing to something else. Exposure. As pressure mounted, authorities continued focusing on the larger picture. Their objective wasn't merely to disrupt activity temporarily. Their objective was to dismantle the structures that allowed powerful organizations to operate. That process required persistence. It required evidence, And above all, it required time. Eventually, that persistence began producing results. The walls around the empire grew tighter, the room for maneuvering grew smaller, and the sense that change was coming became increasingly difficult to ignore. For people who had spent years watching the rise of Superfly, the shift felt almost surreal. Legends have a way of appearing permanent. They become part of the landscape, part of the culture, part of the stories people tell. It's easy to assume they will always be there. Until suddenly they aren't. The reality is that power can disappear far more quickly than it is created. Building influence takes years. Losing it can happen in a fraction of that time. History has demonstrated this repeatedly. From organized crime bosses to cartel leaders to street kingpins, the pattern rarely changes. The climb is long. The fall is fast, and once the fall begins, stopping it becomes nearly impossible. For Superfly, the years of influence, reputation, and power had created a legacy that extended far beyond individual